Greetings and welcome to another Comodo Cybersecurity webinar. This is Bill Weinberg, Director of Communications for Comodo Cybersecurity, and I'll be joined by Dr. Kenneth Geers, Chief Research Scientist for Comodo, who will be talking today about the role of malware in intelligence operations. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. Most of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with the BrightTalk interface and with the BrightTalk hosting service. During the webinar, if you have questions you would like to share with the speaker, we will be taking them through the user interface where you can enter questions on your screen. We'll be addressing those questions at the end of the webinar. The webinar recording will be hosted on BrightTalk on this channel after the webinar's finished, probably within a few hours. And you can also write to us directly for more information on the material presented in this webinar and, of course, on products and services supplied by Comodo Cybersecurity. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kenneth Geers.
Hello, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Here's a slide of me just quickly. I did 20 years in the U.S. government. I've been doing some sort of signals intelligence since '93, a couple of degrees in international relations, so that I sort of apply that to the cyber domain. And I think about the intelligence side of things, or the who and the why of hacking, right? And to put it in geopolitical context. So enough on that. Please get in touch with me at my email or Twitter if you want to discuss the intelligence side of hacking. Okay, so I put this slide together this morning because it's just the highest layer sort of our malware types put on a traditional map. What I want you to see here is that immediately the kind of analysis that I do, sort of that I call, strategic traffic analysis. So I'm not at the bit level, but I'm at the kind of the higher side of the hacker space. But immediately, with my 2 million rows or so rolling in every day, you can see that there are quick patterns that you can notice, right? First of all, there's a socioeconomics to malware. Now, if let's say you're a 3-letter agency, right, or you're a king or a queen who wants to use hackers for some purpose, this gives you an interesting capability, because there are plenty of poorer countries out there without a properly functioning government through which you can route your communications, right? So we have something like 26 or so top malware type categories. And I said, okay, well, for each country, what's the number one? And you can see that for most Northern Hemisphere countries, it's applications. But as you get further south, worms, viruses, and Trojans are much more prevalent. Now, if I take off the applications, then it's going to be Trojans as number 2 in the north. But in general, there's an interesting socioeconomics to malware. And one of the ways to think about it, let me show you this slide, is that the Trojans and backdoors form sort of a higher class of malware, right? And worms tend to travel the web, autonomously. And often they're still running around. We still see, for example, Stuxnet and other things running around the internet. They take advantage of more pirated software, less licensed software, networks and enterprises that are not properly maintained, right? And so here you can see that, Trojans, for example, leave a smaller window, for other things in Switzerland. But in South Africa, look at the domination by viruses in worms, right? Russia is somewhere in the middle. United States, a little bit closer to Switzerland, but is not quite as tight, right? So what does that mean? That means that, Trojans, backdoors, let's look at Trojan. As in its Greek mythic namesake, there needs to be some deception or trickery involved, right? And that's why you get so many applications in the north. And I'm going to show you some data shortly that will demonstrate that applications are actually attacking the United States at present in our election. And applications are one way that hackers are going to get the initial reconnaissance that they need for further hacking, right? So now I'm going to look at this first timeline so you can see on any given week, Comodo has about let's say, I think about 230 plus top-level country code domains where we see malware. So it's really fun for me as an analyst that you see so many places with malware, right? Because that allows me to do things like compare, Poland and Germany, Armenia and Azerbaijan, etc. So that's one thing. But you can also see sort of like the ebb and flow of malware and how it runs across the planet, especially a worm, and then gets patched, goes away, and you're waiting for the next round, right? So the data in this presentation literally will be based on millions and millions of rows of data. Trojans are our most stable and dangerous, complicated data set, right? So you can see here, these are just over the past 6 months, some of the major outbreaks in Trojans that we have seen, right? Certain events like Ukraine and Egypt there on July 29th and August 2nd, I'm not quite sure what happened there. A lot of times I do go in and try and figure out what happened, but you would be surprised. And if you don't believe me, send me an email. But so many major malware outbreaks you can directly tie to geopolitical affairs. And I'm going to show you plenty of examples of that shortly. Worms are really volatile, right? And they tend to be used for some kind of a strategic purpose. Not every day, but I'm talking about major campaigns. Stuxnet, after all, it can do many things, but is often referred to as a worm because that's one of its most dangerous functions. It can spread like wildfire, right, across the planet, taking advantage of open vulnerabilities, right, and so compromise many machines at once. That's why I look at worms as a strategic threat to the internet. Here's viruses, and the thing to notice here is that I should write a paper just on the connection between viruses in Ukraine. You can see 4 of the 5 top spikes this year, and we have some visibility in every country. So it really allows this kind of cross-country correlation that I do at Comodo is quite effective. But in particular, Ukraine has a terrible problem. Now, Ukraine is at war, right? And so it's not surprising that they're in a difficult also space in terms of cyber attacks or computer network operations. But the geopolitical side of viruses in this case would be to collect information and intelligence on an ongoing war. As you know, Ukraine sits right in the middle between East and West, between Soviet and Atlantic Pact, and now the movement of NATO East and the defense of Mother Russia from, So it's not a surprise to see all of this malware in Ukraine, as it's, for example, called by Wired Magazine's Andy Greenberg referred to it as a laboratory for malware. So enough on that for the moment. Backdoors, they present sort of a higher return on investment, a more expensive kind of malware, right? And I think this story in particular may have to do with the Skripal alleged assassination attempt in the UK. I see activity between the UK and Russia, some of it taking place in northeastern Italy, but a very high level of backdoors. I've confirmed that they're not false positives. but they also have tended to rise and fall with events in this story. A little bit more on certainly more on Russia later in our webinar. Now, I want to talk about geopolitics and intelligence, right? If you're in charge of your country, right? How does national security work? First of all, national security is a subjective discipline, right? And it really tends to, like worms, roll with the ebb and flow of what in Washington or the United States would be on the desk or the plate of the president, right? It really does. And in other countries, the same. I'll show you many examples of that in this webinar. I like this slide because it's a little bit controversial, but allow me to explain. The highest spike, now this is all detections of worms, Trojans, and viruses that we have seen, and again, this is based on thousands and millions of data points, in the US for the last 6 months. So the highest spike was on March 13th. Well, so then I go back and I say, well, what happened on March 13th? And it was the day that Trump announced the name for the new Secretary of State and CIA director. Now, my interpretation on this is this would give foreign governments, foreign hackers, their contractors and subcontractors, et cetera, fresh meat, right? And we know for a fact that even, for example, Rex Tillerson, as U.S. Secretary of State, was constantly following Trump's tweets because they didn't have a good relationship and because he needed the tweets to know what to be doing that day. So if our own Secretary of State and our own Foreign Service is that dependent on Donald Trump's tweet, you can bet that foreign hackers across the world, and that's why we see this spike, at least in part, right? So it's foreign hackers writ large. Again, this is malware. Right? These are concrete data points. When a major geopolitical event happens, there will be an effort to gain as much information as quickly as possible. Okay, so at this point, you may be saying, I don't really follow the logic, or I think it's a bit supposing in that case, right? Well, so here's a clearer case. These are Trojan detections in South Korea. They take place simultaneous to the annual U.S.-South Korean major military exercises, right? And so this is pretty clear. So on March 29th, April 1st, we're engaged in war games with South Korea. So not only our two countries, but you know, it's obviously of interest to us. But think about it: Russia, North Korea, China, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan. All of these countries, they're also very interested in what's taking place. So that's why we see this super spike in Trojan detections, right, during this period. Now, so a little bit on the political side, I'm going to end this webinar with a lot of data analysis relative to our upcoming election. But this is one from a little while ago that, for me, is fascinating, right? So this is all detections, everything that Comodo saw summed up in USA, Russia, and China, right? And I just drop it on a single timeline. And you can see the red circle there right around the U.S. inauguration. And this also serves to highlight from the Trump tweet earlier, when you have a major geopolitical event like this, in this case in the United States, for the entire world, it is an opportunity to collect very valuable information. Intelligence services, again, and their contractors and researchers, et cetera, maybe even on their own, they're collecting information at a much higher rate, right? And they're not just reading CNN. What they want to do is get information that is not in the public domain. So here is, it's fun, as I said, to work with Comodo because we have installs in every country, including North Korea. So I've got many more of these North Korea analysis slides. This is just the first one that I ever did, and it's pretty out of focus. But I like it, so I'm going to show it to you. When I saw that we had North Korean detects and installs, I just dropped, the first 6 or 9 months on a timeline, and I see that major spike in the middle. It looks a little bit like a shark fin, right? I say, well, what happened then? And Donald Trump was at the United Nations that day announcing, X, Y, and Z on plans for North Korea, but if North Korea didn't, adhere to our interests, that he would totally destroy, in quotes, North Korea, right? So this is a major geopolitical event, and I'm not saying this is American hackers or any doing any kind of attribution here. But what I want to say is that this was a big event in international affairs and was accompanied by a major spike in malware detection. Now, if we go a little bit up in time to two recent summits, right? So sometimes I'll just see the spike and then I'll say, well, what happened then? And of course, I might get it wrong, right? And it might be a coincidence. But I've got enough of them that I think I have a critical mass in many different domains. But in this case, I knew there was summits coming up, right? So then I go to the network space in question. In this case, it's Singapore. So I just isolate Comodo detects in Singapore, drop them on a timeline, and you can see the summit also had the attention of hackers, right? It's clearly visible. And then when you geolocate it, it's very near to the venue of the summit. However, of course, Singapore is very small, so let's try another one. Here, there was the summit between Trump and Putin in Finland, right? So I said, okay, let me, again, drop our major malware types on a timeline, and I see that it was a massive spike in virus detection in Finland, and it was simultaneous to the announcement of the summit. So some hacker group out there took the opportunity to jump in at that moment. And you say, well, it could also be a coincidence, and that's true, but I geolocated that virus spike to the neighborhood in Helsinki where the summit was going to take place, right? Not only that, but the other day I was presenting this slide at a conference, and someone from the Finnish CERT was on the front row, and he held up his laptop and he said, got the same data right here, right? So corroborates our detects. Now here is something very recent, right? So often when something is really big in the news, I'll try and check it out and see if I can find reflection of it in cyberspace. Because remember, cyber is just it's a reflection of real world affairs anyway. So look, here's our detections in Turkey and Saudi Arabia around the alleged assassination of the Saudi journalist in Istanbul recently, right? So that happened on October 2nd. Khashoggi disappears, right? You can see on the very same day, we have exploit detections, right? On October 4th, then we have backdoor detections, and these are at a much, much higher rate than normal. And I think, there's at least some months, right, on both of these slides. And it's a little bit delayed in Saudi Arabia, but you can see on October 14th and 19th, massive spikes. Now, what's happening here? In general, I think there's three kinds of cyber attack. You can gather information, right, and it's unauthorized in an aggressive way. You can block information, or you can manipulate information. And I think that computer network operations kind of come in that order, both in sophistication and frequency. Most of this, what I'm getting at, is cyber espionage, right? Intelligence agencies from somewhere around the world, they're gathering information very quickly about an event that is of extremely high interest. And as you know, if you have looked at the news over the past 2 weeks, this particular event is of extremely high interest to intelligence services and countries and heads of state around the world. So that's on the foreign intelligence side of things, right? But now I want you to consider the opposite side, the defensive side. And you're responsible for your own network space, right? For your own law enforcement jurisdiction, national sovereignty, your own castle, keep, whatever you want to talk about. That's the most important thing to you. I mean, what's happening in some other country is cool, but above all, you want to protect your own family, right? And your own career and your own country. So most, I think a whole lot of what I'm seeing in terms of detects is actually, it can be proactive or reactive, but they're hacker operations of a domestic sort, right? And I can't prove that, but I've got lots of data supporting that, and it's logical, right? So in this case, Belarus passed legislation against fake news. On the same day, you see a giant spike in virus and then Trojan detections. And often, and I've got much more specific slides soon to show you, but you'll see maybe applications coming first in terms of gathering recon, right, on a target space. And then you'll see viruses and worms propagating malware into a space, and then you'll see Trojans and or backdoors that are indicative of leveraging compromises, right? So this also is quite logical here, virus and then Trojan. But it perhaps in this case, now some of this may be foreign hackers interested in what's happening, but we'll have some of that soon. Here's a case in Armenia. There was, on April 25th, a peaceful revolution, right? It's still ongoing there, and it's a surprising turn of events. However, what I want to point out is that these are all of our malware detections on one, red bar or two for Armenia. But you can see on April 25th, there is a simultaneous spike, right, between the real-world revolution and something happening in cyberspace. That these are not Google searches, these are not Wikipedia searches, this is malware, right? So someone is leveraging malware for geopolitical purpose, and it could be on the defensive side or offensive side. And in that very large spike, some of it is going to be foreign intelligence, some of it law enforcement, some of it counterintelligence, and some of it what's called hacktivism, right? A mix of politics and activism that can be, for any purpose, and it can come from the private sector or even Matthew Broderick. Here's China, right? And again, all of our malware detections just thrown on a timeline. And what's interesting about June 24, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are too young, but I'm certainly not. And I remember the Tiananmen Square events of 1989. So again, I believe that some of this would be a mix, right, of foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, and law enforcement. However, this major spike can be explained by the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Both the Chinese government, the American government, the Russian government, and many, many others, they're very interested in what's happening in China. Is this going to lead to protests? Is it going to lead to another revolution? Who knows? But we all have national intelligence requirements, right, on to figure out what's happening in that space. And so this is as clear as day, basically. So some things, harder to put your finger on, but the countries might be, let's say, the less, well-traveled, but events taking place there are no less important in their own national context, right? So I see this huge spike on May 24th, and I say, well, what is that? And it turns out that on the front page of CNN, you have Amnesty International accusing Nigeria of human rights abuses, and this is a Nigerian network space. So, on the Nigerian side, this is an effort, probably, we don't know, to protect their own country, maybe who knows. It's different in every national context, and I won't say too much more about attribution at this point, other than to say, the geopolitics are quite clear. One, let me interject here. I think that a lot of what we're seeing on the internet is actually nation-state operations, and so that's going to fall to our diplomats to try and figure out. I'm not sure that nations want to get rid of this problem because they're probably all somewhat addicted to cyber espionage. Here is a case in Nepal, a major spike, and then I said, well, let's see what happened in Nepal on that day. And it's the same day that Nepal scrapped a contract with a joint project with China to develop a dam, right? So again, that could be a coincidence, but that is a major international event, and I'm going to show you soon in slides, whenever events cross the international threshold, they will be a greater target for hackers, right? And one of the reasons for that is because Computer network operations take advantage of the fact that there's only one internet and only one cyberspace. And all nations are really struggling at this point in time to maintain some control of national sovereignty and law enforcement jurisdiction. In other words, there's no fear or of prosecution or retaliation for hacking. You can hack all day. You know, the White House can hack the Kremlin, and the Kremlin can hack the White House, and nobody's going to drop a bomb, right, on either side. So it's kind of the new way that international politics is played out, including soldiering and spying. Here's a case that is limited to the financial domain, but remember, you know, maybe it all goes back to money anyway. So on this day, I think on March 13th, St. Kitts and Nevis was added to a blacklist, right? International blacklist as a tax haven. Well, on the day before that, and here's a telltale factor, drop your malware detections on a timeline, and if something happens before it's widely known, that's kind of like insider trading, right? You can assume that something is happening that is perhaps some intel service knows about prior, right? It's not public knowledge. So in this case, before, the one day before, we had also the hacking had begun, right? But in this little country, this massive spike I don't think is a coincidence. And then again, if it crossed the threshold for some kind of serious attribution, you could probably figure out who that was, but it would be with a mix of logic as well. So now let's talk about a controversial topic, cyber war. And there's a lot of skeptics out there, but I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that every domain, you know, whether you're a student or a romantic or a politician or an artist or a soldier or a spy, you know, you do what you do now via the internet. So cyber war is a thing because, again, you know, three-letter agencies and militaries, they're going to use the internet for force projection, for intelligence gathering, etc. And ultimately, if you think about it, you know, take two tank armies, you know, sitting inside those tanks or planes or ships are computers with operating systems and applications that are vulnerable, right? And that's why cyber war is a thing too, right? You got to get out of the mindset that we're still operating some kind of a pre-internet military. Okay, so I went to Estonia in 2007 from the Pentagon, basically to look at what Wired magazine had called Web War I, right? Sort of the punishment of Estonia in cyberspace for political reasons. Well, here's an interesting case that I just saw this year on March 28th. Croatia decided to side with the West to find a Russian spy and kick them out in solidarity over the Skripal assassination attempt, right? And so, again, one day later, this massive infestation of malware. And logically, this could be, basically, it could be some kind of espionage, but it could also just be punishment, right? A little bit what happened to Estonia in 2007. Cyber is nothing if not a Swiss Army knife, right? You can do anything with it. You carve a pumpkin or watch TV, right? And so in this case, you know, it could have been a punishment over that political move. Now let's move more tactically to battlefields. And so these next few slides are isolated to the Middle East, but what they do show is that especially when events get big enough that they cross into international relations, great power domain, you'll see hacks, right? So in this case, look, chemical weapons attack, OPCW, that's the Office for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Possible U.S. military action, last one, international concern over chemical weapons. So that would not be surprising at all, right? Because you have major powers interested in what's happening on the ground in Syria, because chemical weapons, they are one of the critical pieces in this whole story. And this is why Obama, you know, came within a breath of bombing Syria, right? And so it's when things get international in nature, and of course everything in Syria is international, but Let me show you other cases. So here in Yemen, you can see on May 9th, for example, missiles fired at Riyadh from Yemen, right? That would be a cause for major alarm in Saudi Arabia, right? Look at July 6th. Yemeni missile hits Saudi industrial target, right? These are things that would engender, they would be magnets for malware in Yemen, right? Because of the international nature of the event. So the same in Palestine, right? So we're probably one of the few companies who's written it all on Palestine, right? Because we have, it's fun, again, looking at the Comodo data set, because we have, we've 20 years old company with a real international presence. You can see that we have good visibility on countries and ideas that are a little bit out of the way, right? So in this case, look, I'll just point out April 23rd event, right? This is Palestine appeal versus Israel at the UN. This is an international event, right? Something that what Israel would be very interested in, for example. But you can see that it is a massive virus spike within Palestinian network space that I don't think is coincidental. Here's Iran, right? And if you squint your eyes, I mean, you'll see some interesting things. I'll just point out only one. But the red cluster there, right, in about 3/4 from the left, that stands out as a particularly tense period on Iranian networks. And on July 23rd, look, it's the infamous tweet from Donald Trump to the Iranian president that if you don't behave, your country will suffer consequences, the likes of which have never been seen in the history of the planet, etc., in all capital letters, right? So I don't think that these things, I've got other examples that didn't make this slide deck in the world, but when there's intense international tension, right, taking place, you will see spikes in malware, I promise you, on your network. And the same is true at the enterprise level. Let's say you're in the healthcare space. You hire a new CEO, or you're marketing a new product, or you have an acquisition of another company. Anything that puts you in the paper, right, anything that makes you richer is going to be a magnet for malware. And the same is true in international relations. So now let's talk a little bit about democracy, because especially since the 2016 US presidential election, we're still trying to work out what happened with that one. But I can show you that elections are strong magnets for malware. And since the United States is going into an election in just a couple of weeks' time, this is really important. So I had seen this one probably in January 2018, as I'm just wrapping up the year. I tried to drop every country on a timeline. And you can see that Norway had one major spike, and it was the same week as its national election. And I thought that was interesting, so I put that in the card catalog. But then I see so many other examples as well. Here was the gubernatorial election, you might remember. This was a major event. Trump was busy influencing it, and it was a focus for the nightly news, etc. Well, there was also a massive detection rate of Trojans just the week prior to the election. Now, what were they doing? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But I think above all, it's gathering information, but we can't be sure. And Trojans can be used for anything, right? I've got remote admin rights to your computer, and what I do with it is kind of up to my imagination, within some realm of possibility, obviously. But you can delete information, you could change information, and it all depends on the nature of the network and the nature of the target. So it's not just in any one country. I'm going to show you numerous examples. Here is in Iraq, nice spikes both for the first round and the recount of the elections. Right, really stands out clearly that there is maybe not only local interest, but a international interest, right, in what's happening there. Here is Burundi, right, and very clear malware cloud around their referendum, right? But the referendum was important enough, as you can see, that NPR is talking about it in the United States. So you know it was important there if it's making the nightly news in the United States. But you can see, again, clear as day on the malware timeline that somebody is either collecting or perhaps even trying to manipulate information. But again, we'll get to that in a few minutes. Here's Ohio. They had a special election at the beginning of August. And on this particular slide, so this, I try to play with data in different ways so that that's easier to see. These are all Trojan detections in the United States for about a 6-month period, just colored by each different color is a state. All of that purple right there in the week prior to the election is Ohio, right? And so that's, probably didn't at the time, I didn't even know there was an election in Ohio, and so you can go either way with it, go from the spike to the event or from the event to try to find the spike. But in this case, it's enormous, and it's quite clear that someone was very interested in this event, if not many parties. So I got interested enough in this that I looked over about, I think, 9 months recently. 45 countries had national level elections of some sort, right? And then I set a pretty high threshold for this chart. I said, at least during maybe, I think, 3 days on either side of the event, it has to be the highest spike for the entire period. And then I'm left with this many. I think there might be 14 or something here. In any case, it's about 30%. So that's a very high threshold, but about 30% of the countries, their national election event basically coincided with the highest malware detection rate, right, for the entire period. And so I think that's really significant. And what that means is that, in Guatemala and the Netherlands, Pakistan and Mexico, all of them basically are going to have a correlation, right, between malware. And that's different. I mean, this is different from social media influencing. Most of what I hear right now in the news is talking about how somebody might influence my vote or opinion in social media. This is malware, which is capable of more, right? It's capable of, not only figuring out who I am, but potentially, manipulating what I think. And of course, social can do that, but you can do it at a deeper level as well. So here, I apologize if this is too small to read, but I wanted to put them on one slide. Well, because I've got too many slides at this point in time, but also because I want you to see a pattern, right, that goes from applications that I think this is a novel finding, even in the hacker space, right? It may be being discussed and I'm just not aware of it. However, when I look at our data, especially for these elections, so some of the previous slides, it was just, okay, here's all malware, right, on a timeline. But we need to dig deeper and understand at a more granular level what's happening, and that's an effort with these slides. So here's Mali, Russia, Colombia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, different countries. But you can see that there is a logic. I know there's a kill chain in hacking, an order of operations in, as far as targeting an individual, as far as, or an enterprise. But I am suggesting to you right now that you can see it on a macro level, on a strategic level across entire countries. So here you've got, if you look at Mali, for example, you'll see application, then Trojan, right? And what I'm thinking is that applications help to provide initial reconnaissance. And if you think about it, it's not just Coke and Pepsi and Sprite, that are using all of these ad trackers and adware campaigns and clickers and free toolbars and things like that. But I'm pretty convinced now that it's also more malicious parties, people who want to do more damage, right? So if you look at the Russia one, right, you see this right before the election on March 18th, March 17th or 16th here, you see a major spike in application malware. These are applications that are going to do things to your computer like try and insert something in your startup processes, right? Or try and alter your browser, or try and geolocate, outside of the parameters that that the application should have. But then it's followed by worms, which is followed by Trojan, right? So in other words, reconnaissance, then propagation, then leveraging compromise for some purpose, right? If you go up to Turkey, you can see the same application, worm, Trojan. And it's nicely correlated with not only the election announcement there, but the election itself, right? Azerbaijan is a bit different, but you can see again, roughly speaking, applications, Trojans, and virus, right? So anyway, enough on that, but we need to look forward to our election in the United States. What can we learn? And some of you may be listening from abroad, and it applies in your case too. This chart is fantastic, right? So I said, well, let me just take the 13 swing states, and I did this by just going to Real Clear Politics and taking the middle ground, right? So these are either toss-up states or just leaning one way or another, leaning toward the Democrat or leaning toward the Republican Party. So if you look at the beginning of the timeline, it looks just about right, right? The orange line is swing states. 13 swing states versus 37 non-swing states. And it looks like right about right mathematically, right? But as we approach the election, now swing states have eclipsed the non-swing states in terms of malware detection, right? So this is really significant. It means that, again, across the board, and, other cybersecurity companies could do this if you just had large enough visibility. But then you can compare, Minnesota to North Dakota and Idaho. And it's the states that are politically significant right now that are seeing this activity. Now, what are they seeing? So we're at the phase now, if you remember from the international elections, it would come, applications, then some kind of propagation, which often worm-like, and then Trojan or backdoor. So it could be that in the United States, we might not see as aggressive behavior, but who knows? I mean, in Ohio and in Virginia, those were Trojan detections, right? So look, here is Arizona, and this is just in the past couple of weeks, right? A major spike in applications. Same in Florida. Same in Minnesota, although the purple they're definitely Trojan detections, right? And specifically in this case, adware. But again, so you may wonder, who is this? And to a certain extent, I would say, as Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, that question is secondary to defensive preparation, right? So we can see somebody's coming, right? So get ready. You're not quite sure, how strong they are, or perhaps even who they are, but you can see indications of interest. So in this case, it honestly, it could be American companies or politicians or researchers or hackers, as well as a mix of foreigners too, right? Missouri, adware Trojan. New Jersey, throw in also ransomware detections. Now, ransomware is one of those things that if I have Trojan access to your computer, I can choose to do anything, really, because I'm sort of God on your system. Now, of course, it depends on who you are, but, I mean, think about it. If you're like somewhere in the election infrastructure, then that makes you pretty important. But ransomware could be used to shut down a system or to hold it hostage, right? That's just an example. It basically means, blocking and or encrypting data for some monetary gain or extortion. Nevada, suspicious applications. Tennessee, suspicious applications. I mean, how in Wisconsin. So we have a warning, right? Our data alone should serve as a warning. In fact, these slides were on CBS News 2 days ago. If you didn't see it, just check it out. And I had a chat with some journalists a few days ago, and it immediately got put on CBS. So as a threat to the midterm elections, but really it does stand as a warning that the malware is there. We can see it, right? So we have to pay attention to these things. So this is actually within the network space within these countries, and this is 3 or 4 days old. I need to go ahead and update it, but I'll be doing that throughout the campaign. Here you can see that Nevada might be in particular, Nevada and Montana, particular danger right now because of worm and virus activity. Could be pushing malware into their space currently, right? I've taken applications off here, and the being Trojan. And then New Jersey, the backdoor detections might suggest that there is already compromised infrastructure that hackers are taking advantage of currently from before. So that is the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said, you can ask them now, or send me an email or DM on Twitter. But I'll be looking at the elections from an analytical perspective over the next couple of weeks, and so we can stay in touch on this. But this is in part this political side. It really shows the flexibility of cyber or computer network operations, right? I do think that it plays a critical role in hardcore military operations, but because we're not usually at war, you won't see it, right? And also the line between, real war and real peace is pretty thin these days, given that the internet encompasses, all countries, right? So intelligence operations, they are going to be, used for many kinds of political intelligence and military operations, but the military will come in peacetime, right? And so if you're at a military base or within a political party, anything like national security infrastructure, you will see attacks in peacetime, right? And so elections are one way in which intelligence operations could be used not only to gain information on what your opponents are doing, but how you could influence them proactively, right? So going back to Sun Tzu too, you want to influence before it's too late, right? Don't let yourself get into a war. Make sure that you don't get into a war by shaping the battlefield or the political space of your adversary. So that's enough from me. Feel free to stay in touch or to ask questions now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kenneth. We do have some questions from the audience. Let me choose one here. For example, can you cite other real-world consequences of these kind of targeted attacks? Stuxnet, for example, may have slowed Iranian nuclear arms development. Any other examples you can think of?
Well, so Ukraine, it's interesting. I think that I did a study for NATO on the cyber dimension of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, and what we determined, because I was also involved in the Estonia response in 2007. Today, basically, you see examples of computer network operations everywhere. So in Ukraine, we saw in the political space targeting their election, in the diplomatic space targeting our U.S. diplomats, trying to embarrass, etc. On the military battlefield, there were certainly attacks. The business space, there were smart TVs, e-billboards that carried propaganda, right, unauthorized. In social media, I teach a class in Kiev, and my students are always telling me that they see within their own personal social media space reflections of the conflict. So there's in critical infrastructure, of course, that's the big one. Between the electricity grid and the railways and the airport, there was just so many attacks. And so this day and age, you have to be aware that everything is cyber, everything is digital, right? And it's only going to get worse. Bruce Schneier just had an op-ed in the New York Times that said, he expects things to get worse because the IoT, or the Internet of Things, is growing underneath our feet all the time. And so as that happens, there's just going to be more and more what hackers call attack surface. And so it's a real, the challenge, the nature of the problem. Now, will it be decisive? I think at the end of the day, if you are a king or a queen or, CEO of a company, it's rare that a cyber attack will be decisive. In other words, take you out, right? But I do think that cyber can win battles and win the day, right, on many occasions. And so, if you go back to the idea of two tank commanders squaring off on the field of battle, if one of them has a 0 day, right, in the other side's infrastructure, then it could be a very, very long day for the, less cyber savvy army. Will it decide the outcome of the war? That's anybody's guess. But I do think that the election malware that we have seen over the past couple of weeks in the United States is very dangerous because, let's say, even if one side or the other wins, the possibility that the hackers will mar the result by scrambling some percentage of the data is worrisome, right? The ransomware that we saw, for example, in New Jersey, the possibilities are absolutely there for nefarious operations. And so, but as we get older and wiser, hopefully we need to be better prepared to deal with the aftermath.
That's great. Another question that came in, very pragmatic. How can regular end users and IT staff monitor these same types of malware trends? And should they be worried?
Yeah, so one of the things that I find is that I have a lot of peers in this space, right? And a lot of them very technical. And so they're looking at a lot of ones and zeros and a lot of individual cases. And well, that's got to be done because that's how I get my data. But if you like my kind of analysis, you can stay in touch with me. But it's about dropping it on a timeline and then looking at your malware and detections of incidents through time. And what you'll see is just like I'm sure you learned in Network Security 101, you should be looking for the random outbound connections from your network happening at 1 a.m. These are things that should be setting off alarm bells, right? And so look for anomalies. And remember the great lesson of the cuckoo's egg, and Cliff Stoll back in California in the 1980s. It was a 75-cent accounting error that basically uncovered a huge Soviet cyber espionage campaign against the West, basically, right? And so a lot of successful cyber investigations, they go back to somebody just wanting to solve a puzzle. Right, and it wasn't necessarily the software or the hardware that did the trick. And I have to say that also believing that Comodo has a very clever solution in that it's an adaptive whitelist, right? And our huge visibility basically allows us to say, this is good, but this is unknown, so it's not going to run on the network. But that's for another webinar.
Okay, thanks for mentioning our Comodo solutions, Ken. Listen, another question we have is reminding us that attribution is one of the hardest challenges faced in cyber forensics. Can you comment on attribution techniques and efforts?
Well, I look at so many of these things every day that I try to be as diplomatic as possible in the attribution space. Here's why, in part. I think in the 80s and 90s, because I worked for the Pentagon for many years, right, doing cyber defense and attribution, we really didn't know who was hacking us, right, in the 80s and 90s. It could have been Matthew Broderick. It could be, the Kremlin. in many cases we were wrong, right? In a couple of cases we thought it was a foreign nation state, and it wound up being teenagers, and one in Montreal, one in California, one in Israel. So, but I think, especially since 9/11, there's been so much investment on cyber defense that now attribution is a thing. And I think attribution actually happens a lot more often than we realize. But now governments don't know what to do about it. And if governments don't know what to do about it, enterprises certainly don't know what to do about it. And so I think the attribution question is interesting. And whether it's, the companies that label kittens and pandas and squid and herring, it's interesting, but is it going to save you and your enterprise from getting doxxed or getting taken, right? And that's tough. The United States deterrence in cyberspace is really hard. I think the United States is primarily trying to deal with this issue. And I think it's really kind of smart, actually, by naming and shaming and prosecuting, right, in the law enforcement side of things. And we're trying to shape the space in positive ways, reflecting U.S. interests, and that's great. But at the enterprise level, attribution is interesting, but I don't know that it's going to help you a lot. And here's the thing. One, what are you going to do about it? But two, tomorrow it's going to be somebody else, right? And so for me, I'm kind of using a blanket term, hackers, and sometimes nation-state hackers or hacktivists. And then I also believe a lot of what I'm seeing is actually domestic. If in countries with poor human rights records, I honestly believe that a lot of the hacking is done by domestic services, right? So it's a fraught space, attribution, for a number of reasons. And so it's interesting, but it's almost like the cherry on top of a ice cream sundae. You don't have to have it. And even when you get it, even the United States hasn't figured out what to do with it.
Okay, very interesting set of answers. Excellent webinar. Have to thank you again, Kenneth, for putting this material together and presenting it so eloquently. I also want to thank our audience for attending this webinar and invite you after the fact to download and share this webinar and share the link and the Comodo Cybersecurity channel on Bright Talk. If you'd like to learn more about Comodo cybersecurity offerings at the endpoint, on the LAN, on the web, and through the cloud, come visit Comodo, www.comodo.com. We're going to wrap things up today. Thank you all again for supporting and participating in our webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you in coming months on subsequent webinars. Come to www.comodo.com to see our schedule of upcoming events, and we look forward to seeing you there, physically and virtually. Thanks so much. This is Bill Weinberg calling it a wrap.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.